Hello and welcome to the big picture. The crisis in Ukraine, which began with the annexation of Crimea into Russia, which the West continues to call it illegal, continues to fester. The Ukrainian forces and the pro-Russian separatists are fighting a pitched battle in eastern Ukraine, even as the Western powers have imposed certain sanctions on Russia and are threatening further sanctions also. Meanwhile, a civil war kind of situation seemed to prevail in eastern Ukraine city of Sloviansk, where the Ukrainian forces are fighting the separatist forces. Meanwhile, the G7, which met in Brussels yesterday and today, by excluding Russia, has demanded that Russia and its President Vladimir Putin pursue a peaceful path to end the crisis in Ukraine. But the crisis seems to be nowhere near an end and in fact is taking more serious proportions. Some analysts even fear that this is the beginning of the Second Cold War. We will discuss the situation in Ukraine and all its ramifications across the world. To discuss this, I have with me Salman, Haider, former Foreign Secretary, VB Soni, former Indian Ambassador to Ukraine, R. Prasanna, Chief of Bureau of the Week magazine, and Sheetal Sharma, Assistant Professor in the Center for European Studies at the JNU. Welcome to all of you. Mr. Soni, I would like to come to you first. You think the position between the United States and Russia on this whole issue, has it reached the irreconcilable stage?
No, it isn't. It is, in my opinion, it's a game of brinkmanship. They're trying to see how much they can extract from the other side. I think it started with Ukraine, with Russia, when the invitation for joining the EU was taken. That would have meant if Ukraine became a part, or as it may become in the future. If that happens, then what happens to Russia's security? Its borders are to that extent only 500 kilometers if Ukraine is incorporated in that. So as a part of their strategic step, they had to ensure that their long-term interests are guarded. And the first step in that was to come to Crimea, to take over Crimea. If one were to see in history, about 200 years or so, Crimea has been a part of Russia.
Yes.
And it was in 1954 that President, at that time, Khrushchev, who was also a Ukrainian, followed by Brezhnev, he was also a Ukrainian. So it was gifted to them. So you come back to the question, Russia needs access to warm waters.
Right.
They do not have any warm water ports. The only access they have is through Black Sea, and in that they have this presence, they have the naval base in Sevastopol. And so that's the reason that was the first step. And if they found that the message is not getting clear, they probably started stirring trouble in Luhansk and Donetsk. These are the two places in East, which is basically Russian-speaking.
So you think that the Russians have started this trouble in Luhansk?
I wouldn't say. I think they were provoked. They were pushed. Because I think the effort on the part of the U.S., particularly, let me also very much clarify you that I think the main thing started from the U.S. The Europeans didn't have their full heart into it. In fact, Germany and France were always against it for various reasons. They have a lot of investment. If one were to go to their far eastern portion, particularly Siberia, it is the German companies who have. So if there are any sanctions in place, who's going to be affected? Not just Russia. Of course, Russia will be
the European countries also.
European countries, particularly Germany
But this Luhansk and Donetsk you're talking about, the people there, are they as pro-Russian as the Crimeans are?
Not to that extent, because there is a little bit better mix. There are a lot more Ukrainians in Luhansk and Donetsk as they are compared to what they are in Crimea. But at the same time, there are certain foolish steps which are taken when they said that all the teaching, etc., will be done in Ukrainian and not in Russian. Now that also provoked them.
So there are cultural issues, there are other issues involved also.
Let me just clarify that what is the difference. A lot of people do not understand what is the difference between East and West. The first difference is that the people in the East are Russian Orthodox Church, whereas in the West it's mostly Catholic because they're close to the. The second thing is bulk of the economic activity happens in the East. All their mines all their minerals, and it's also a breadbasket. More importantly, it is also the place where there are sophisticated technologies, particularly space-related technologies, which are servicing Mir station in the space. That also is there. Also, please do not forget the fact that that is where most of the military hardware was also produced. The T-80 UD tanks, which Pakistan got for more than $500 million, were supplied from that particular region. So that's where the economic activity is happening. And more importantly, also there are design bureaus. The aviation sector is very well established. Basically, that is the area which produces so much for the coffers of Ukraine.
Of Ukraine. And Russia is interested to see that it doesn't become part of...
for this reason, because strategic interests.
Mr. Haider, when the G7 leaders excluded Russia from their meetings, and now they're saying that Russia should engage in peaceful resolution of the crisis. How will that happen? Has a stage been reached where things have really become so difficult that peaceful resolution at this point of time is a difficult problem?
Sorry, it's very difficult, certainly. I think all sides are agreed, and they've expressed it frequently, that there should be a peaceful resolution.
Yes.
But how to achieve that?
How to achieve that?
And I don't think anyone has found the answer. Partly this is because local forces are headstrong, have been difficult to control, and the extremists have provoked...
Would you call them extremists or separatists?
Well, they could be both, and that they have actually tried to provoke situations that enable them to advance what they believe is their cause. And this has created disruptions that in the attempts to calm things down.
But Mr. Soni was talking about how the Americans started it first. Would you also look at it that way? Is that the general view outside Russia?
I think it's not very easy. Mr. Soni, of course, is the expert in this area, and he's seen this himself. He's served there. I don't think the Americans were trying to provoke matters, but I think what was happening was a process of Ukraine drawing closer to the West was actively stimulated by the West and by the EU, which was the question of Ukraine advancing by degree to a closer and closer association and eventual integration into the EU with its strategic implications.
Right.
This was a process that we saw. And this, in fact, rang alarm bells in Moscow. And it became a difficult and a sort of... to begin with, it was more a question of an economic issue.
Yes.
And economic integration.
Yes.
Which then developed security and strategic overtones, which have now really overtaken the initial problems.
Okay. Sheetal, how does the European Union look at this now? Mr. Soni was talking about how Germany, especially, was not too keen to create this kind of a trouble because it will affect themselves. Now, what do you think? Where does the European Union stand?
Girish, the current crisis in Ukraine, as we see, or I understand, or I would like to explain, is a consequence of many things, political, economic, cultural, linguistic, and it is gradually becoming a strategic and a security issue as well. Now, when we talk about European Union is also, in any case having a fatigue, in terms of the Eastern enlargement, that they have already incorporated so many lesser brothers from the East that they themselves are finding it difficult to how to, make this union more homogeneous in terms of, equity, equality, development and all these issues. Now, within this situation, the Ukrainians have, or the people in Ukraine have different kind of aspirations. The East divided the West. And the Eastern, at the same time, Russia on the east side of Ukraine also has a Eurasian dream. And all these people driven by their personal interest are somehow adding to the fuel to the fire, that is further, aggravating the conflict. Now, EU had at one point of time could have offered Ukraine a membership. However, once the Copenhagen criteria, now it seems to be so difficult to be fulfilled in. But EU seem to be reluctant in order to involve Ukraine into the domain of the or ambit of the EU. And what has happened, seeing this reluctance on the part of the EU, some of the people, the pro-Russians, have gravitated towards Russian side to fulfill their aspiration, what they see that Russia can help them to do that. Whereas people pro-Ukrainian, those who are driven towards the western part of it, they have their own set of aspirations in terms of freedom, democracy, rule of law and human rights and all that. But EU delayed its decision to incorporate Ukraine. They just offered them economic help, but not otherwise what they wanted or what they could have done towards contributing to the peace and stability in the region. That's why, Russia could play an important role, and all this happened last November when there was a U-turn, taken by Viktor Yanukovych when he denied, the kind of EU, the agreement, the trade agreement that they were supposed to sign with the EU. Right. And that escalated into this crisis.
Okay. Prasanna, there is a new president in Ukraine now, and the G7 leaders are asking President Putin to have talks with them. You think in this kind of circumstances there is any scope for talks between these two?
No, we also had to look at the kind of the atmosphere in which this election was conducted, and right. So Russia has already, refused to even recognize that. So I don't think that this is the time. One should have any expectation of the Putin administration opening. At least formal communications with the new regime in Kiev. Okay. Because Russia has been saying there had been a legitimate regime in Kiev earlier, which was, through a subversive process. That's what the allegation from Moscow is, that through a process that was, undermined through street protests, which was Western funded or Western NGO funded and all that. So I don't think...
There's a very interesting this thing about how Western NGOs had been funded to create this crisis.
The crisis in the street protests were
I would like Mr. Soni to react to that. I'll just come to you. Let him finish.
And in fact, Western diplomats were actively seen on this street protests. In fact, they were seen even distributing sandwiches to the Russian the street protesters. So Russia has a very genuine case there of not recognizing the present regime, just as because the first legitimate regime was undermined there. So
Mr. Soni,
yeah,
this allegation about Western NGOs having been propped up by the West to create this kind of a scenario.
It's quite evident that the rightist forces, so-called pro-Nazi forces, they were very much there. In fact, they were the ones who were creating problems. It was not as if there was anybody else. It was a provocation by them. And of course, they were egged on by the NGOs. That also is a fact. But to my mind, Putin has not outrightly rejected the election of Poroshenko. It's a guarded one. It's not as if he's giving away the option. To my mind, there is still a hope that there will be meeting. There should be some kind of a meeting ground between the two of them, and both of them would be in Europe. In fact, tomorrow is the Normandy landing.
Right.
So at the Normandy landing, Putin is going.
Putin is going, and except Obama, I think he's meeting many of the European leaders.
Right.
So you expect anything to emerge out of this?
No, I think the dialogue is very, very important. There has been no direct one-to-one dialogue between the two sides. If you were to see, there are always
the Russian foreign minister and the Americans have been talking to each other.
Yes.
But that has not been able to, they have not been, right from the time the Crimean crisis started, the Lavrov and the American counterparts have been talking, but that doesn't seem to have, brought about any solution to the crisis. In fact, it has aggravated since the Crimean crisis.
But the fact is that the dialogue is going on. It has never gone out of hand, number one. Number two, the atmosphere was not there. Because first they were saying, let the election be over, because how can we possibly deal with illegal government, etc.
Right.
So now that has happened, my guess is that there will be meeting between the two presidents, and at least the door will be open for further negotiation. I'm not for a moment suggesting that they will come to an agreement in the very first time. No. because there will be again some kind of game which will be played, because Russian game is that there should be more kind of a federal structure.
Exactly. What is that federal structure with the Russians?
So right now everything is controlled from Kiev, but if the federal government, that means there are about 15, 16 regions, if they have a little bit more freedom
Autonomy.
to decide on their own, not full autonomy as such, but on issues, particularly like cultural issues, the language, the traditions, etc., then they would be able to stem the attempts to totally to deny the Russian language studies, etc.
Mr. Haider, what kind of a role do you see for the UN Security Council in this? Russia is demanding that the UN an emergency meeting to for ceasefire in eastern Ukraine and all. Do you think the UN Security Council will be able to do anything in this?
Well, if it is as badly divided as it is at the moment, it's difficult to see what they can do. They get together. But what Ambassador Soni is saying seems to me to be eminently sensible, which is that so long as these two countries, the two America and Russia, are engaged with each other, they will work to at least reduce, if not eliminate, the risk of a conflagration, something that flares up and creates trouble all around, not only within Ukraine, but within the region, and perhaps with consequences far away from there.
Since the time the Crimean crisis started, at that time also this was being spoken about, that at least the dialogue is still on, the doors are still open for discussions and things like that, so it may not escalate. But it has escalated ever since.
It has escalated, but not to the point of a kind of all-out military confrontation. It has escalated in the sense that there have been more incidents, but they've not always been consecutive incidents.
It has spread beyond, it has spread to different places also.
It has spread, certainly. It has. So it has spread, not necessarily escalated in terms of the intensity of conflict. And certainly the problem, if it is not solved, it's going to grow. It's not going to go away.
Grow, Sheetal, there is this, you may call it alarmist, but some people are also talking about, this could be the beginning of a second Cold War and things like that. Do you see it that way? Do the Europeans fear any such developments?
It may be a reflection of Cold War, but it is not the beginning of the second Cold War. Because neither the US or the major European countries have appetite for building a strong defense along the eastern border. Even Russia now is not that strong party that it was, in the Cold War era. So it is not in the interest of any of the parties so far involved that they begin another war, be it a hot war or a cold war. And yes, we agree the fact that the crisis has escalated beyond the, the ability for the state to contain it. However, it would continue if in case, a strategic decision is not being taken. And the separatists, if they are not controlled, say, as Ambassador Soni was saying, that Russia will recognize the new government and Poroshenko. And this is, if you see chronologically the events, even Russia in the process over 4-5 months, last months, have become little less aggressive in its degree, of engagement with Ukraine. And that is why we cannot say that this is beginning of the second Cold War, not at all, as far as my understanding goes so far with the status of the events. Yes, certainly the crisis is there between the people. The civil war will continue until there's a strong internal government that takes care of the needs of both the sides, which are having their set of demands and aspirations, certainly.
Prasanna, would you see it as the beginning of a second Cold War?
Not a second Cold War, but as Sheetal was saying, there are the reflections of the old Cold War are still there. But when we talk of Cold War, it involved the entire, it was about the very existence of the bloc itself, the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. That kind of a situation we are not finding now. But we are finding
the kind of the Western forces coming together on this issue. So that is what is creating this kind of or giving analysts scope for coming to this kind of a conclusion.
Yeah, analysts use these terms for better understanding, but actually it is not a full Cold War in this, because as I was saying, the Russians have defined certain red lines are there. They're strategic red lines, which they are not going to consider. Of course, the Black Sea, the predominance over the Black Sea, I mean, they want to freely operate in the Black Sea, and those things they are not going to consider. But short of that, yes, Russia may concede certain political, and as Sheetal was saying, yeah, there has been a softening of the positions also on the Russian side also, which was who were earlier accused of being very, very aggressive and rigid on the issues. No longer. There will be accommodation, but the strategic red lines that the Russians have defined, I don't think they are going to bargain over that any longer.
Ambassador Soni, would you agree with that?
I entirely agree. I don't think we have reached the stage where you can say that it will be beginning of a second World War. Sorry,
Cold War.
Cold War. No, that's not going to happen, because there will be more games will be played. I can assure you. You see, you have to see two other things which coming out of it. China gaining a lot of leverage, economic leverage. Amount of gas, the deal which has been talked about is $400 billion.
In Ukraine?
In Ukraine. No. Russia and China.
Russia and China talking about.
So that's another issue. Please also don't forget the situation in Syria and Iran nuclear deal.
Right.
Now, there are, I mean, after all, the Russians also hold up some cards up their sleeves. So if they were to go back to the Cold War days, then it will be, again, not trusting each other and unnecessarily, increasing their military spending, etc. So that, to my mind, they are not ready, because Europe also is economically, they have a lot of catching up to do. I mean, a lot of damage which was done during the meltdown time, that has to be done. And of course, Russia is in any case doing it. Ukraine itself needs so much of help. $16 billion is nothing, because their foreign debt is of the order of $60 billion.
Whom do they rely upon? Can the European Union give them that kind of an assurance to take care of the debt crisis?
They have only offered $14 billion.
Right.
That's nothing.
Exactly.
The important thing is that requirement is a lot more, particularly when the gas deal doesn't go through, then they will have to pay the market rate, which is absolutely unthinkable, because other countries in the region like Turkmenistan, etc., they are also not giving any special concession to them.
So the dependence on Russia for them is inevitable.
I think they are. The Soviet system was such, if I may remind you, that there was nothing integrated at one place. One thing was given, one technology was given to one portion, the second technology was given to the second. For instance, the T-80 tanks, etc. Some guns were coming from another part of Soviet Union, and so that they could control.
Mr. Haider, is that the kind of control which Russia has over these regions, which will keep them going, and which will keep these countries out of the hands of the Western powers, however much they may try to take control?
That suggests a kind of malign influence by Russia, which I'm not quite sure is appropriate in this case. I think that you talked about a second Cold War. I think the second Cold War, or the Cold War, had a strong ideological component.
Right.
That I don't see here. I think that there was some attempt. People talk about democracy as opposed to autocracy, but I don't think it has taken on that kind of dimension that would. And what we are saying is perhaps something that is prior to the Cold War, which is a balance of power.
The shifting of balance of power, is that what you are seeing now?
I think that is important. I think to see where the balance now lies. And the point that was being made here about the red lines and so on, I think these are what we have to look at, because they are indicative not of positions of principle alone. You could cloak them in whatever language you want, but they're questions of saying that this is an ineluctable position that we must take, a country, in this case Russia, must pursue, because that is its requirement for its own security
and its own national interest.
And so national.
Prasanna, shifting of balance of power, is that happening? Is this also an indication of that? Ambassador Soni was talking of Syria and,
rather than shifting, I see a
because there are some analysts who feel that Russia has gained in strength in the last 1 year or so. This is also an indication of its a show of
No,
strength?
I'm not seeing a shift, but rather I see a continuation. In fact, I look at little historically. I mean, you look at the Soviet Union. The strategic aspirations of the Soviet Union were the same as that of the Tsarist Russia of the 19th century. And you look at the Putin's or the post-Soviet Russia, the strategic aspirations of post-communist Russia is the same as that of communist Russia. So the continuity is there. There is nothing that way has changed. I mean, as he said, there are only permanent interests and permanent strategic interests. They are also continuing.
Sheetal, has Russia emerged a little stronger in the last few years? After the breakdown of the Soviet Union, you think there is a revival of the Russian
Slight, I would say, not very much. But if in case Russia plays an upper hand in the Ukrainian crisis, it will gain in terms of military, power, its ability to hold on to certain naval bases, and its geopolitical and strategic and military interest in the area. Whereas the Western world is more hinging upon the ideological, war, that they still want to see freedom, human rights, stability and peace prevailing in the area. Although, of course, there are hidden economic interests. European Union also is dependent upon, Russia for gas, and most of the gas comes through Ukraine. So, at the face of it, they talk of normative order and, a kind of society where stability and peace is there. However, interests are always economic and political. Whereas what Russia is doing is very overtly, a kind of demonstration of its strength. There may be a slight degree of change in its might, but not very much to equate it with the Cold War era.
Mr. Ambassador Soni, last words to you. Is it very crucial for Russia now to emerge from this crisis? As Sheetal says, that if it emerges from this crisis stronger, it will have a better hold over the balance of power?
I would agree with that, because they have been humiliated, as you can very, very well imagine, and they are very self-respecting people. Now, unfortunately, immediately after the breakup happened, they didn't have any leadership. The only leadership they provided was by
Yeltsin.
Yeltsin was the one who was the buffoon, they call it. So he messed up everything. Putin, whatever you may say, at least he thinks for Russia, for Russia as a country, emerging country. He's trying to get back a bit of that pride.
Okay. I think on that note, we need to end. Getting back pride, that's very interesting. How it will all play out in the coming days and weeks, we'll have to wait and watch. But this is a situation which can turn, as some of my panelists feel, that it can turn more dangerous if it is not handled properly. We'll wait and see how all the powers will handle this crisis which is on in that region. Thanks to all my guests, Ambassador Soni, Prasanna, Mr. Salman, Haider and Sheetal. Thanks to all of you. Please keep watching. We'll come back with another issue in Big Picture same time tomorrow.